Speaker, for that guidance. Madam Speaker, when you look at the fourth schedule, one of the functions of national government is disaster management.
Senator Kajwang and Senator
So when we have a national legislation, Madam Speaker, it will harmonize in terms of disaster management in the country. Madam Speaker, one of the funds that are normally misused by counties is on the issue of disaster response and disaster management in counties, and even at the national level, Madam Speaker. For example, in Nandi County, in financial year 2023-2024, according to the Auditor General's report, the approved budget for disaster response and management was 100 million. The exchequer releases that was released through CRF before moving to the next financial year, Madam Speaker, was 50 million. But when the auditors went to seek financial statements on the spending of 50 million, they could not be able to trace 50 million that was spent by Nandi County Executive, Madam Speaker. I have sat in Public Accounts Committee for almost 7-8 years now, Madam Speaker, and one of the critical issues of funds of disaster has been the misuse and abuse of those funds, Madam Speaker. Because sometimes the disabled are called, like for example, which we used to call zero diet when we were in school, and maybe just a few photos to look good before public that we are helping the vulnerable. I'm happy that we need the law that will always guide the issue of disaster management. Madam Speaker, and you know, disaster can come in many forms. I want to appeal to like even school fires, which have become predominant for the last few months, Madam Speaker, and we continue to condole with families who have lost their loved ones, especially in the Ndarasha Academy incident where more than 21 children have lost. We have seen a number of schools across the country that have been burned down, dormitories, school houses, Madam Speaker, because of what is happening. And the biggest support system in terms of disaster response and management has been the Kenya Red Cross Authority, or Red Cross, Madam Speaker, and that has assisted. I remember when we lost, I think, some children in Tuya Bay a number of years in Kiptuya Ward. We had to get young men, Madam Speaker, the famous Lodge divers. And I'm still surprised up to today why either the national government or Baringo County government has not hired Lodge divers who always come and assist us in retrieving bodies that have drowned in a number of rivers, especially during rainy season. Madam Speaker, and therefore it's challenging. The other day, one of the TV stations carried a story where young men are crossing in vulnerable rivers, Madam Speaker, because of rains, especially in Kapkangani Ward, Madam Speaker, in Nandi County. So the disaster, the dynamism of disaster continues to evolve, Madam Speaker. And as we even pass this law, we must give room to what disaster should be, how it should be handled, Madam Speaker. Even as I speak, Madam Speaker, the Nandi County Executive the other day was carrying a massive human resource audit, Madam Speaker. And the disaster we have, and the unfortunate issue, Madam Speaker, is the governor finds after 7 years that he realizes that there is disaster of ghost workers, Madam Speaker. But we were shocked a day like yesterday that a number of people close to him, what we call professional radio callers to praise and worship him in our famous radio calling stations, Madam Speaker, bloggers, online bloggers, and close siblings, Madam Speaker, appeared in the payroll of Nandi County government. Madam Speaker, even as we talk about the spending of funds, I want to ask Eacc to improve in their network so that as we discuss about funds belonging to disaster, as we discuss about wage bill, as we discuss about development expenditure, Madam Speaker, we must agree that there is something wrong in terms of management, Madam Speaker. Therefore, Madam Speaker, it is very unfortunate. And Madam Speaker, I'm disappointed because the disaster we have in Nandi is running down of both disaster response and management. And also, Madam Speaker, where Governor has hired 3 of his siblings to work as Assistant Director of Education, one of his campaign soloists as Chief Officer of Education, some online bloggers, Madam Speaker. Most of these people have never attended their duty stations, Madam Speaker. And I think these are issues that continue to bedevil, Madam Speaker, especially in Nandi County. And I condemn with the strongest terms possible. And I hope, Madam Speaker, in the next 1 month, the county executive must appear before national cohesion, Madam Speaker, and even public accounts, Madam Speaker. And I want to assure the people of Nandi that the way we are looking, the 100 million that had been approved for the budget, Madam Speaker, they must account for everything that they do, Madam Speaker. You can run, but you cannot hide, Madam Speaker. And that is why last time I said the headwaters of corruption was Nandi County, and it has been vindicated over time with the mess that we see where cronies, siblings, Madam Speaker, are hired by the governor of Nandi to work for them, and we shall resist, Madam Speaker. I want to assure the people of Nandi, Madam Speaker, if I had the power to initiate impeachment, I would have done it long time ago. It is that the MCAs that initiate the impeachment and the Senate uphold the impeachment judges, Madam Speaker. Number two, Madam Speaker, is on the issue, even the evictees from Mau. We must see how we can handle forest evictees. Madam Speaker, I said in disaster, there is what we call forest evictees, like in Cherargei, Madam Speaker. We have in Mau evictees, forest evictees, Madam Speaker. But there is also a new form of evictees, what we call infrastructural evictees, Madam Speaker. And those infrastructural evictees we see in Nairobi here. We see in major cities, Eldoret, other cities across the country, Madam Speaker, be it Kisumu, counties want to expand, Madam Speaker. In fact, in Mosoriat, in my local center, Madam Speaker, there were infrastructural evictees that were being evicted, Madam Speaker, by the county government of Nandi. Madam Speaker, those evictees, even along Namgoi, Madam Speaker, that is what we call infrastructural evictees. You can realize, Madam Speaker, that is another challenge of disaster. Because when you evict people, like what happened in Toi Market here in Nairobi, Madam Speaker, you create what we call infrastructural evictees. The traditional evictees that we have known are maybe flood evictees, because the floods were the other day, Madam Speaker, here in Nairobi because of the floods. The one Cherargei, Mau Forest evictees, Cherargei evictees in Nandi Hills and across the country, Madam Speaker. That continues to be a challenge. So as we define in terms of handling disasters, Madam Speaker, we must agree that, Madam Speaker, the last session, Madam Speaker, when I was the chairman of Justice, Legal Affairs and Human Rights, and we didn't investigate the issue of Solai Dam tragedy, where it killed, Madam Speaker, a number of Kenyans that died during Solai Dam tragedy, Madam Speaker. And I'm happy, Madam Speaker, Senate at that time, in the recommendation that was done by, Madam Speaker, by the current governor of Makueni and the former senator of Makueni, Mutula Kilonzo Jr. At that time, Madam Speaker, the famous Commissioner Colin Kanata and Chief Kiragu and Mashakul Patel had connived to pay off the victims without being charged because court of the law, Madam Speaker. And as much as I sympathize that the outcome of court has been that every family be compensated 1.2 million, between 1.2 million shillings and 800,000, I expected a harsher penalty. Because that, Madam Speaker, that famous Patel Dam in Solai, Madam Speaker, killed many Kenyans. It swept away more than 3,000 coffee farms. There were more than 200 million cubic meters of water that was washed down, and many lives were lost, Madam Speaker. Therefore, Madam Speaker, it is unfortunate that we lost those lives in 2018 in May, when that unfortunate disaster happened in Nakuru County, Madam Speaker. These are challenges that we should learn from. And I'm happy there is a legal framework in terms of disaster management going into the future, Madam Speaker. Even at that time, we lost more than 45 Kenyans. Schools were destroyed, homes, their lives, Madam Speaker, when we went for the sitting, and then as a committee that followed up implementation. The people of Solai, up to today, they have nightmares. When they hear even the tire burst, Madam Speaker, they always. So even as we pay them off, we should ensure we have counseling services. We should give them, assist, counsel them, Madam Speaker, so that when I had the opportunity of visiting Brazil with the Committee of National Security, and then there was a case of Rumandinho, collapse of dam in state of Minas Gerais, in Brazil, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, apart from being impressed with other things in Brazil, Madam Speaker, I was impressed by the disaster preparedness of that country, Madam Speaker. Within 20 seconds, almost 100 choppers had been mobilized after the collapse of Brumadinho Dam, where a number of people, Madam Speaker, 270 people died in that Brumadinho disaster, Madam Speaker. When we visited 2-3 months down the line, Madam Speaker, we found the responders were still on the ground, collecting even every bone of anybody who lost their lives in Brumadinho, Madam Speaker. And the way the response was organized was masterclass, Madam Speaker. At that time, the state prosecutor of Brazil, Madam Speaker, had already fined the owners of that sludge $7 billion US. And the owners were still in court, Madam Speaker. The other day, in the same incident of Brumadinho Dam collapse in state of Minas Gerais in Brazil, the courts also are fined through the union because the indirect contracted of that dam, Madam Speaker, had not been compensated. They have even fined the same owners over $200 billion US, Madam Speaker. And yet the owners are still being prosecuted by the state prosecutor. That is when the rule of law is functional, Madam Speaker. Apart from compensating families, number 3, Madam Speaker, the prosecutor also has pushed the owners of Brumadinho Dam, Madam Speaker, to do environmental regeneration, to ensure the environment is left the better it was before the destruction of Brumadinho Dam. That one we have failed to do in Solai Dam, Madam Speaker, in Nakuru County, Madam Speaker. I'm happy with this national authority in terms of National Disaster Management Authority, Madam Speaker. We are able to ensure, Madam Speaker, that anybody who is found out of criminal negligence, because what the committee of the Senate, the Hado Committee, and I don't know whether Senator Kajwang was part of it, found that the owners of Patel Dam or the Solai Dam, Madam Speaker, were criminally liable. And I'm happy, Madam Speaker, although I hope the Attorney General will appeal that matter, we need to give harsher penalties because we know there are many people who own ranches who have dams that have not been certified, Madam Speaker. There is what we call, Madam Speaker, NEMA. We need to know their role. There is what we call National Water Restoration Agency, National Water Towers, Madam Speaker, Kenya Water Towers Agency. What are they doing when they approve the building of small dams, water pans? What is their role, Madam Speaker? We know when the rains were many, most of the dams in the country, Madam Speaker, National Water Harvesting Authority, what are they doing so that when these dams and pans, Madam Speaker, are overflowing with water, they might not affect, Madam Speaker, the lives or kill the lives, Madam Speaker. I think on the issue of, Madam Speaker, we saw another form of disaster. I don't know whether you call COVID disaster, because, Madam Speaker, you remember even the Senate committee at that time, there were allegations that more than $7.8 million US, Madam Speaker, were lost during the fiasco of COVID scandal, Madam Speaker. And you remember the whole country, the whole world went on lockdown, Madam Speaker. On the issue of COVID funds, when the COVID happened, Madam Speaker, many counties were able to give what we call to funds appropriation, supplementary budget to cater for what was happening across the country, Madam Speaker. What we found out subsequently by the OAG, most of the counties misappropriated funds, and that is why they were the new birth of COVID billionaires in town. And when you see new money in town, Madam Speaker, is the birth of COVID billionaires. There are people, when other Kenyans were dying, others were becoming billionaires. And it is sad, Madam Speaker, that up to today, no one has prosecuted COVID billionaires. And that is why some of us always question, what is the role of Eacc? Because people who stole COVID billions are also disturbing us up to today, Madam Speaker. Yet Eacc and this year, apart from the few people they have taken to court, no governor has been charged over misappropriation of COVID funds. No state, national, former government officials who were there in 2020 during COVID have been charged in court. And that is why when Eacc says they don't have resources, sometimes we ask them, what have you delivered? What are the results that can drive more resource allocation in terms of capacity and resource to remunerate the functionality of Eacc? So, Madam Speaker, even as we look at this, and I know there are people who sit in CPIC, Senator Eacc, And I'm happy that he has taken the advice of the majority leader of staying put in the House, Madam Speaker. The Eacc, I've looked at those investment funds, Madam Speaker, on a number of several occasions, and they will give recommendations. And I know when you realize most of these investment, like a bursary fund, education fund, Madam Speaker, and I had majority leader saying today that most water companies are struggling, and I agree, like a Kericho Water and Sanitation Company is also struggling. I think functionally is Eldowas, the one for Nandi has collapsed. In fact, people are running around in Kapsabet with jerry cans, Madam Speaker. Women are struggling. This should be a gender-based violence, Madam Speaker. Because if you find women now, instead of going to saloon, are struggling to get water in Kapsabet town, the famous mode of transport is donkeys. So whenever you pass as you go to Western Kenya, don't be shocked, because the Kapsabet Water and Sanitation Company, under the leadership and governorship of Sang, has failed, Madam Speaker, in terms of water provision in Kapsabet town. And that is what is scaring investors. When you come, the reason many people live in Kapsabet town, not in Eldoret town, including the governor, Madam Speaker, is because there is no water and sanitation, there is no sewerage, Madam Speaker, and that is what discourages investors, even from Migori, from investing in Kapsabet town, Madam Speaker, because there is no water. And the functionality, and I hope the Eacc will be able to tell us, these water companies across counties, how do we salvage them? How do we make them functional, Madam Speaker? Clause number 9, Madam Speaker, I want to ask the majority leader that we amend the chief officer of the Council of Governors, CEO, we need to replace, because we are giving Council of Governors too. Can we put it youth, PWD, and gender, Madam Speaker? And then number 2, clause number 27, I agree that we need National Command Center. Madam Speaker, when we went to Brazil and we visited Brasilia, when the former president of that time, he was
Senator
called...
Senator Eddie, Senator Cherargei, do you want to be informed?
Yeah, I don't mind. He looks